of the Governance and Audit Committee. If we start on the agenda, item 1, the apologies for absence. No, there are none, thank you. Item 2, declarations of interest. No, there are none. Item 3 then, the minutes of the last meeting. I'll go through page by page if I may. These are for correctness only, so that's what we're looking at. Page 3, page 4, page 5, page 6, page 7, page 8, page 9, page 10, page 11, page 12, page 13,
Chair, thank you. I'm not sure the minute reflects what we agreed at the last meeting with the wording as to who we were calling. So I just wanted to raise that matter because I'm not sure the minutes are correct according to my notes.
Okay, I certainly know that obviously the resolution number 2. This is for item 8, yes. Yes. It's on page 15, which is the resolution. It's resolution number 2, where the committee resolved to call in the director and the head of service, because we've got them here, because it's an item on the agenda, but the minutes actually just say the head of service. If that could be corrected, please. Thank you very much. And in regards to item 3, resolution 3, we'll deal with that when we get to it. So page 15, page 16, then the actions, page 17, and page 18. Someone prepared to move, please, as a correct record? Thank you, Norma. Someone prepared a second? Thank you, Councillor Cox. Is there anyone against? That's the easier way to do it, rather than everyone put their hands up. No? Thank you. That's carried. Item 4, then, we have the call-in. Oh.
Sorry, can I just make a point about the minutes, not in relation to their accuracy. One of the things I raised at the last meeting was the importance of having actions noted and recommendations, and you know, it's good to see that we've got a sheet at the end of the pack, but actually I think it's really important to incorporate those actions in the minutes themselves, or recommendations, whatever they may be, so we're really clear what the discussion led to, and that we have that schedule, which should be a rolling schedule, that we can visit every meeting to see the progress with the actions and the recommendations. So I think that would be really helpful to the committee if that could be done. And I did pick up 2 that I thought weren't covered in the action log, and that maybe they're a recommendation, but that was about attaching Public Services Ombudsman for Wales's annual letter to the next report, and that we needed more information on equalities data. So I think they should be noted as something that needs to be done, please.
Rhys.
Do you want to come in on that, Chair? Yeah. Thanks for that. So we, based on the responsibilities of the committee, we've got to just be really clear within, and I suggest we do this as we go through each agenda item for future meetings, be really clear about what is coming out of there. We shouldn't really be dealing with a lot of actions. They might be comments or recommendations, specifically the recommendations you make, because obviously they have a statutory basis as well because of the Local Government Elections Act. So we need to be really clear about what those relates to within it. So I think, Chair, with your permission, we'll do a bit of housekeeping in between meetings to try and tidy some of those things up. As I said, we shouldn't really have a lot of actions. There may be comments you want to make to officers presenting reports. They can be taken into consideration, but there will be some very clear recommendations, and I suggest you keep a log of those recommendations then. Yep.
Yeah, thank you, Rhys, for that. Okay. If we go on then to item 4, which is the call-in for the Director of Social Services and the Head of Service, read the internal audit of adoption allowance resulting in a second unsatisfactory opinion. Can I thank Sally for coming along as Director? And I can't see a name, unfortunately, because Rob said, Natalie, thank you for coming along to committee this evening. Obviously, there will be questions on the unsatisfactory audit reports, because obviously there have been 2, which was of concern to the committee, and obviously of concern was because they were adoption allowances which be paid to citizens as well. But if I hand that over to you to start, and then obviously members will have questions, I'm sure, going through.
Thank you, Chair. I'll take the introduction, if that's okay, and then I'll hand over to Sally.
Sorry, Andrew, I didn't mean to steal your thunder there.
Sorry, no worries. No worries. So thanks, Chair. This is the report relating to inviting the Strategic Director for Social Services into Audit Committee, Governance and Audit Committee, on the recommendation of members regarding the 2 unsatisfactory audit opinions in relation to adoption allowances. So the reasons why we've invited the Director in today is to provide you with assurances that appropriate improvements within the service have been made and that the control environment moving forward has improved. So initially improvements have been made, but subsequently internal audits were made aware that the service was no longer being provided for a period of time, and discussions were held with Director in particular and the Head of Service. So specifically for this afternoon's meeting, members should consider and accept the explanations and assurances provided by the Strategic Director. That will be confirmed in the follow-up audit, which we are in the process of doing at the moment. Or members don't accept the explanations of assurance and escalate their concerns to the Chief Executive or the Exec Board. So in terms of a bit of a background, this is a bit of an unusual one for us, Chair, in terms of the second unsatisfactory. Originally, when we did the audit, it was unsatisfactory. We then followed it up and it was reasonable. It was reasonable in draft, but when we were trying to finalise that particular report, it came to light that no service was being provided due to the lack of resource within the team. Therefore, we felt that we had no alternative but to finalise the report as an unsatisfactory opinion. We have been in discussions with the Director and the Head of Service to move this forward and gain assurances that things have been put in place to improve the control environment, to improve the financial stewardship. And as I said, that will fall out in terms of the second follow-up audit, which we were in the process of doing. I'm sure Sally and Natalie will be able to provide you with the assurances that you need, and then you can offer them, ask them any questions you feel is necessary. But in terms of the report, there's just a bit of background in terms of how we've arrived at the unsatisfactory opinion, the second unsatisfactory opinion, and also in Appendix 2, there's an action plan of what came out of the original report, what management agreed to do at that time, and then an update in terms of where we are in terms of October 2022 of what has been progressed and what the current situation is. I'm happy to hand over to Sally and to Natalie.
Thank you, Andrew. Sally?
Thank you and good evening. I won't say that it's a pleasure to have been called in, but I am glad to have the opportunity to meet with you and to talk through the outcome of the 2 unsatisfactories. I think there's a couple of observations that I want to make before we come on to the action plan and any questions that you may have of us in terms of the progress of where we've got to. I think the first thing is just a note of really an observation is that we were aware that there were challenges in this area of work, and we initially requested this audit because we knew that there were challenges here. And I think one of the things for both of us is an awareness that when that happens, we need to call on the resources of our colleagues in audit to really understand that. I suppose one of my reassurances for you in terms of this committee is that no adopter and no adopter child has been without because of our failings in this area. And I think in part that's because of the step that we took midway through, that we wouldn't instigate reviews during that year and we would pay the uplift. And that has meant that no child, no adoptive family has had suffered as a result. And I suppose the other thing that just to draw to your attention before we go to the report is that adoption allowances are a very small part of the whole package of support that we give to adopters. We pay adoption allowances to a relatively small group of adopters for children who have the most complex needs. But for all our adoptive children, we work with the South East Wales Adoption Service and the National Adoption Service to provide a whole range of support and services in addition to the financial support. And I suppose one of the things that I am really clear about is that actually our building of that support has been quite independent of our failings in relation to the financial support. So what we've been able to offer in terms of therapeutic support and social work support is in addition and has stood as a good element of the service throughout this period. You have in front of you the agreed action plan, and as Andrew has already stated, the further review of the service is currently ongoing. I suppose what I would draw your attention to is a series of actions that we have put in place, not just to address the fact that the service in effect ground to a halt for a period, but also to look to build some resilience for the future. Because I think what became clear from this audit was that we had a position which did have a failing because we did not have a resilience. So what we've looked at within the team that this sits in is to ensure that a greater number of staff are able to undertake this task and to fulfil completely in order to ensure assessments, both the initial assessments and the reviews, are completed. Obviously that's within the action report that you have before you. I think the other element is to reassure you that at this point of time that all applications for this year have been progressed and have been progressed within the time frame that we'd expect. And again, that is, I wouldn't say it's reassuring because it should just be a matter of fact. Of course that should happen and that's the way it should be, but it's still nonetheless, I am glad that we are now in that place. Natalie's just going to pick up a little bit in relation to the last action, which is the review of the policy and the updating. She's just going to comment quickly on that. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you, Sally. Just to kind of again reassure committee that we have a newly appointed service manager who has significant experience within this area, and she's currently in the process of drawing together an all-encompassing policy for Newport in terms of how we manage this moving forward. So I'm hoping that, you know, in the event that there is another audit, just to determine our progress, that audit will be satisfied with this particular policy.
Thank you for that. Obviously, members will have questions. I think the reality is we shouldn't be looking at the past in great detail. We should be looking at how we move this agenda forward. I'm sure members will raise some issues about, you know, what... But I think, you know, we're at a point of time now that we need to look forward and, you know, given some of the statements you've just made, is just to get that reassurance. But I'll open it up for questions first, if I can. Anyone got any questions? Norma?
Chair, thank you, Chair. And thank you very much for giving us more information. I think it's good to hear that no child or family were impacted adversely as a result of the issue. And as you rightly say, Chair, we want to look forward, but I think it's important that we learn the lessons from the past in order to move forward. And a couple of things that worried me when I was reading the paper, for example, that you know, you had the absence of the principal officer and the finance officer for some time. And I found that difficult that you weren't able to provide a response because those two people were away. So is it that they were the only people that knew what was going on?
Yes, and that for me is the learning in this, is that the resilience that we had in place in terms of the relevant officers was key. Both of them were off with ill health for that period of time, and both were off for a substantial period of time. But I suppose just referring back to the comment I made is that the learning for that in that is that the resilience just wasn't there. And so going forward, and I hope what Andrew and his team will be able to pick up is that what we've really looked at is trying to expand those who have some oversight of this work. I mean, one of the challenges is it's a small number of assessments each year. And again, like lots of skills, it's one of those things, the more you do it, the better you get at it. But because it's a small number, spreading that knowledge can be challenging. But clearly what we've learned from this is we need to ensure that there's a spread of confidence in carrying out these assessments effectively. I suppose the other thing I'd add to that is that whilst this is one element of assessment we do a number of other financial assessments, for example, special guardianship, and there are similar skills in some of this. So some of it is looking at where we can share some resilience to ensure that we've got that in place for the future if we were in this awful position again.
Is it complicated doing these financial assessments?
There's quite a lot of paperwork involved.
Is it complicated, though?
I wouldn't have said it was complicated, but there are a number of steps involved,
okay.
And there's a number.
And are there desk instructions in place?
Pardon?
Desk instructions. So could I go in and follow a desk instruction and do it?
I think you would struggle in terms of following a desk instruction, in terms of the number of steps that are involved and the number of things. You do need a breadth of understanding around finance, DWP, adoption, children. There's a whole range of things that are involved as part of this assessment. So it's not just a step one, step two, step three. There's more to it than that.
Yeah, because I seem to pick up from the report that there are two major issues, and that was the need for the review of the procedure, and that was the issue of staff capability. So obviously there's a lot of work to do there in terms of staff capability generally, and I think you covered that.
And that work's ongoing in terms of both the individual staff, but also ensuring, as I say, that there are other staff. And going back to Natalie's point, I think there is something really advantageous about having a service manager come to us from a different local authority, perhaps to bring a more critical eye to the policy that we have got and the procedure, which is also helpful.
Okay, I think that's fine. Thanks. Thank you.
Councillor Horton. Sorry.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair. I guess my only question really is to the audit team, and that is, do you have confidence in the work that they've undertaken already to be, for when you go back in and re-audit, that you will see the changes that are necessary?
Okay, thanks, Chair. Yes is the short answer, because we've been in negotiation and conversation with the director and the service manager. But the proof of that pudding will be when we actually go in and do the follow-up audit. Then we will recheck. We will follow through the issues we picked up previously. We will check to see what has been put in place by the service to demonstrate an improvement, and then I'll be reporting back into Governance and Audit Committee, hopefully with a more improved opinion.
Don first, and then Councillor Mogford. I'll call you in, and then Councillor Cox. I see you're ready as well.
Just a comment on with the, because is there a danger that people who have been should have been receiving this allowance because of the failures for the various reasons, that they've actually been overpaid?
That's the decision that we made, that without the review, that rather than risk anybody be detrimentally impacted, some people will have been overpaid, not by huge amounts of money, but they will. But I think that's the decision that we made at that time, and we did discuss that with colleagues in audit, that in terms of the routes that we could take to ensure a temporary remedy, and the numbers that are involved, as I say, are small, that was a better option than anyone suffering detriment. And that's why we made the decision that we did.
Okay, thank you for that. Can I just follow that up with a question then? What if there is an overpayment? What is going to be the attitude towards the people who are overpaid?
The decision was already made at the time that we made the decision to not review, that there would not be a call-in of those overpayments for the reasons that we've outlined. The fault lies with us in this instance.
Thank you very much.
Councillor Mogford.
Thank you, Chair. Just a comment. I don't think the microphone is picking up your voice very well.
Thank you.
Maybe the moment's passed, Andrew, but could you share with us when the next audit will be done? You touched on the fact that there will be another audit. Can you just remind us what the timescales are for that?
Yes, certainly, Chair. We've started that already, so it will be hopefully completed within Q3 by the end of December this year. potentially moving into quarter four by the time we discuss the report and get that up to drafts, etc. Or what I would say as well, Chair, is this is an unusual one for us in terms of the double unsatisfactories. It's not a case of management or the director not doing anything on the back of an audit report, which we've had previously, following 2 consecutive audit and satisfactory opinions. We've been in constant discussions with the director and the service and got assurance from them that they are moving forward and they have taken the audit report seriously and they have addressed some of the issues that we talk about. But when we come and do the actual audit report, the follow-up, then obviously we can check that and report back.
Councillor Cox.
Right, I think that's it, isn't it? Yes. Well, I've still not really got an idea of the sense of proportion of this, because in one part in the report it actually says that that the numbers involved are quite small. Yet in another section of the report it says that the number of forms that had not been completed was substantial, because it went on for months, didn't it? This without so is it possible to give us a sort of sense of proportion? I mean, how many individuals are we talking about? What sums of money are we talking about?
There's quite a big range in terms of the sums of money that are involved, because it depends on earnings and various other factors. So in terms of the range of money that people get, and also because allowances vary depending on the needs of the child. So there's quite significant variations in the amounts that are paid for a number of factors. And also because sometimes we agree to pay adoption allowances for, say, 1 year, rather than for the lifetime of a child, perhaps agree for a year. And sometimes we agree to pay very specific things for a child because of the particular nature of the adoption. So to give you an example, we might agree to pay for childcare for a period of time for the initial part of the adoption. I mean, we very recently agreed to pay for karate lessons, and that might sound rather random, but it was important for this particular child. So there's a whole kind of range of things wrapped up with this. The actual allowances themselves are linked to fostering and some of the Welsh Government rates that we also have and that we work with. Andrew will be able to clarify the numbers for you more, but I mean, we are talking about each year, we're talking about just 2 or 3 new applications in each year that we would have for adoption allowances that we would agree. Obviously, over a period of years, that becomes more, but in each year, the new applications are really quite small that we would be seeing, and then we review every year.
The two other, if I can, please, Chair, 2 other points. I was really, one thing that surprised me on this report is that obviously at the end of the report, a range of people are asked to identify issues, and under HR here it says that there were no issues. And to be quite frank, as somebody who's managed people in the past, as soon as I looked at this and saw that there'd been clearly an issue with the job not being done, that there'd clearly been a warning issue, then the person had gone off sick, that it sort of jumped out at me that was an issue that maybe there was nothing there, but it certainly was an issue that I as a manager, I would have certainly been concerned about and wanted to investigate and look at from an HR point of view. I just, you know, and again on the same sort of vein, that I just wondered how the thing had gone on so long without it somehow being raised. I mean, it says, for example, the major reason why this arose was that the person who processed the forms was off ill. But you know, in my experience, usually, you know, if somebody's off, does a job and they're off ill, it's not just left. Or if a person's getting to a stage where there's an issue maybe with them coping with it, that it's not just left, it's raised, it's escalated, there's involvement at a different level.
I'm just picking up the 2 parts of that. So the first in relation to HR, I mean, I think, I mean, Rhys would be able to correct me, but or Tracy, the HR comments are in relation to the process itself, not the individual. So any steps that would have been taken in relation to that particular individual will sit outside of this, and I don't think HR would be commenting on them for this report. I'm sure somebody will correct me if that's wrong.
No, I mean, it wasn't so much there was no comment, it just said there was no issue, which, anyway.
I think perhaps they mean there's no issue in relation to the process and the report, but yeah, it's two slightly different things there.
Okay,
yes.
go on, I accept that. Okay,
yeah, thank you. In relation to the wider issue in terms of why it wasn't picked up, I mean, again, obviously we've had some of those discussions with our colleagues in audit. It wasn't just 2 members of staff who were off sick, it was actually 3. So there was one individual, there was then one member who was off with initially COVID and then long COVID, and then actually the service manager as well. So there was a sequence of 3 officers that were off. And again, it's not an excuse, I think it may be an explanation. It was a period of time in that particular team when, because of COVID, we were working very extensively with our commissioning services who manage this team because of the work that we do within the care homes. So there were particular challenges. I still think that means we should have clocked this, but nonetheless, I think it's an explanation of why it went under the radar to some extent, basically. And again, I think it opens that door, picking up on your colleague's comment earlier about what we've learned. I think there's something about where things sit within social services and within children's services and the best fit, and sometimes we haven't quite got that right, and we need to ensure that we have going forward. So yeah, a number of things that we are still looking at in relation to that.
Can I just say, sorry, just finally, I raised that, not, I don't know if I'm going to tell them outside the brief of the committee here, but I raised that not so much in terms of the audit monitoring the performance, but I raised it more out of concern for staff welfare, to be quite frank. If there were situations going on where people were, I mean, you know, let's be quite frank, that the pressure on staff in local governments increased enormously over recent years, and particularly during COVID, it was a particularly difficult period, and so it was more out of a sort of an issue of welfare, really. I raised that point, I think.
And thank you for that, and thank you for raising that. And I suppose, I mean, some of the discussions that we had with our colleagues in audit were about resource and capacity and how we could look to broaden the breadth. And I think we were all struggling in that period of time to ensure that we had the right resource and the right capacity. But thank you for your concern. And, you know, again, that is something that is very much on our agenda in terms of the welfare of our staff. And how we ensure that, particularly in continuing challenging times.
Just apologise, I did promise at the last point. The other thing, maybe I misread this, but it said it wasn't brought to the Cabinet members' attention because it was an operational management issue rather than a strategic issue. But, I mean, how bad would something have to get at a management level? I mean, you know, we're talking a whole operation. How bad does something have to get in a whole operation? Or can it get very, very bad before a Cabinet member's involved? Or is it a matter of degree how bad it has to get? I mean, that can't surely be a blanket statement that the Cabinet member's never involved with an operational issue.
No, it's absolutely not, and it shouldn't be a blanket statement. And it's the nature of things that come to Cabinet member attention and when. And again, that's something that we need to ensure that we get right.
Right.
Thank you, Councillor Cox, for your contribution there. It's really good. Are there any other? We had a mixture of questions and comments there. Do we have any comments from anyone?
Sorry, Chair, just one other question. You tactfully avoided answering the question about the overpayments. So a decision was made early on, as you said, to just, not in a blasé way, I know it was the same was done with the COVID and business payments and things like that. A decision was made, let's just do this and make sure everything is supported. But what is that actual number? What is the number of overpayments that were made, please?
I couldn't tell you the exact number here and now, but what I can say is it's tiny. I mean, the vast majority of people's circumstances don't change from one review to the next. We could go away and find that information for you.
Yeah, it's just the way you use the word tiny. To me, tiny could be £100,000. To you, it could be £10. I don't know what that is.
It's definitely significantly less than £100,000. Way, way less than that.
Are there any other questions or comments from anyone? No, I'm going to make a couple of comments. I think from what, obviously with the questioning, that they've been very relevant and valid, but I think the assurance that you've certainly given me, whether it reflects on other members, is that you're taking this matter extremely serious now. As you said, you've got a new service manager, you've got a greater number of staff, you've built the resilience back within the team. One of the saving graces, I think, for me was all applications have been progressed to date, so there's no one out there waiting for any money. It's great that there's a skills transfer going on, so skills in this one team may be transferable to another team. So, again, that goes to resilience. And I think the most important thing, again, is lessons have been learned, and they're continuing to be learned. So, you know, as we go through the action plan, I'm sure that, you know, those items will be addressed. And again, for me, that gives me reassurance from where we're at. When you read the reports previously, I think there was huge consternation that people weren't getting paid and things weren't happening and such like. And I think, you know, what you said this evening gives me that reasonable assurance at the moment. I'm pleased that Councillor Mogford asked the question about when the audit will be done. And thank you, Andrew, for that. And hopefully, if it can be done by December, that would be great. Because what I was going to suggest to the committee is that in the January meeting, we just have a catch-up or, you know, a state of play as at that time, if we can, from your initial inspection of the audit, you know, just to give us some reassurance that things aren't being dropped off, even if we don't get the full audit report. So that's from me, and obviously we've got the recommendations for us. I don't know whether it should come from me, but I am going to suggest it, is that we should look at recommendation 1 here. I think we're not at recommendation 2, and thank Andrew for putting it there. I think given the reassurance that the Director and the Head of Service has provided us with this evening, we accept, you know, the explanations that have been given and the assurances from both the Director, amend that little recommendation there, the Director and the Head of Service, which will obviously be confirmed by the follow-up audit, but I would like just an interim report, if not the full report, by January, just to give us that reassurance that things are being done and things are being looked at. That's the recommendation I put before the members. Could you achieve that, Andrew? Is that...
We'll work towards that, Chair. Yeah, we go through a process in terms of doing the work, getting it reviewed so it's up to the appropriate standard, discussing it with the manager to make sure it's factually correct, as in the service manager, and then putting it through the process.
Okay,
so
but you could give us an interim update, couldn't you?
If all those ducks are in a row, we should be able to report that.
You know, even if it's not completed, that would be great. So that's the recommendation, number 1. Someone prepared to move, please. Councillor Horton, thank you. Someone prepared a second. Don, thank you very much. Anyone not in favour of that recommendation, please show. Not in favour. Thank you, that's unanimous. Can I thank Sally and Natalie for coming along this evening. You're quite welcome to stay if you want, but clearly if you've got other business to carry on with, then have a safe journey home. Next item on the agenda is the annual corporate wellbeing self-assessment report. Tracy?
Thank you, Chair. Shall I introduce and then we'll pause for any questions?
Yeah, thank you.
So this is page 33 in the pack. The report, as members will see, is in response to the Local Government and Elections Act requirement for self-assessment, but it also incorporates the Wellbeing of Future Generations Wellbeing Objectives annual report. That combined report was the subject of Audit Committee discussion previously back in May, and this is the first time the report has been written in this way. It reflects back on the previous corporate plan of the authority, and clearly this is the last year and we're in the process of setting our new objectives and the new corporate plan, so something of a time of change there. And the report is also taken to scrutiny committee in terms of contents and performance, and for tonight it is about reviewing and assessing risk, reviewing the governance arrangements and whether the report is fit for purpose in that context. We obviously take those comments on board, and finally those recommendations or comments will go to Cabinet for the final Cabinet sign-off. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for that,
Sorry.
Rhys.
Yes, Chair, and just to add, so we're really clear with the committee, there will be a series of comments you will want to make, which we'll note in the minutes. But it's very important that you have a series of recommendations out of this, because that's what goes to Cabinet, and we will have to respond to those recommendations formally, or Cabinet will have to respond formally to the committee on those recommendations. So just to say that, so I think I've agreed I will make some notes of those, so when you get to the end of this point, we can be clear about the recommendations the committee wants to make.
Thank you, Rhys. Thank you. Is that it, Tracy? Good, thank you. Okay, members have seen the report, hopefully read the self-assessment report. Are there any questions? No questions. That's interesting. Can I just make a few questions then? I just have some difficulty in this report of working out, if we look at wellbeing objective number 1, which is the education, skills and employment, and looking at the steps. So we've got the wellbeing objective 1 to improve skills, education and employment opportunities. Step 1 is improve school attainment levels and ensure best educational outcomes for children. There's nothing then within the document then which deals with attainment. And again with item 7, and I haven't got, I've just picked a few up. Item 7, improve school attendance, reduce exclusions and improve safeguarding and well-being. On page 44, the evidence you produced here, which presumably is the national evidence, school attendance across primary 91.4 and secondary 88, has fallen. So whereas the objective is we're going to improve school attainment, the reality is it's fallen, but there's nothing in the document about an action plan as to how you're going to address that, and who's going to take responsibility for it, etc., etc. So those are the only concerns I had in some of these. And again, there was a lot of narrative, but very little outcomes in regards. You've got your steps, but again, and I know there are plans behind this that sit behind, but if the 7 key objectives are those 7 matters, then surely that's what should be reflected in the document. Now, I understand again, and I'm sure other people may come in, is that this is trying to do 3 things, isn't it? It's trying to do the self-assessment, it's trying to do your well-being plan, and it's trying to do the corporate issue. And I'm just concerned as whether actually it's trying to do too much and it's actually losing focus on what we as a committee, because we as a committee have got a very small remit in this and we've got to get the bones out of it, and it's whether it reflects that. So that's the only question I pose is, it's the first one, I fully accept that, it's the first one, we're all on a learning exercise, but are we trying to do too much too quickly in this sort of exercise? I would welcome your view, Tracy.
Sorry,
Sorry, Councillor Horton. Tracy?
It is trying to do all of those things and also, I think, provide a readable document. Interestingly, at scrutiny, there were 2 sets of views about there's too much or there's not enough information on lots of things. So I think there is that issue also. We are here to develop this approach. There is the issue also about it being out of time on kind of older objectives and coming out of a pandemic. That's not to excuse the way the report is written. We're keen to take feedback there. But it is a complex year in which to be reporting. We'll be interested to look at models from elsewhere and take feedback here and, and from other members, from scrutiny, and we look to improve that in the future. I think the alternative has its own problems too. To have different reports has its own problems too. You end up with regulatory reports that are less readable and less relevant to the public, and I think we're trying to blend that there to satisfy all those requirements.
Yeah,
but I take those comments on board, of course.
I think as a committee that's difficult we've got, because we've got a very specific remit in regards to this, and it's, you know, it's getting the wood from the trees in some respects. So I know what you say. Councillor Horton.
I was just going to say exactly what Tracy said there, and it came through overview and scrutiny on Tuesday, and we said exactly the same thing, that there's, in some respects, there's a lot of detail, and in others, there's not. And it is, it's a juggling act for you guys, I guess, of how you satisfy everybody whilst not upsetting everybody else.
I do wonder if, I don't want to kind of try and fix things on the fly here, because we'll take comments from committee and we'll come back, but there might be something in pulling out into the overview reports for the different audiences the salient bits. So you may have the, if you like, full fat version, but we're pulling out the bits that are of interest to this committee, which is, rather than expecting committee members to do that separately, I mean, that might be one model that would work.
I understand that. So you have a body of the report, and then you have self-assessment, well-being, corporate assessment, something like that. Okay. Sorry, Norma. Sorry.
Thank you, Chair. I realise it's a very challenging document to do, and I realise we've got a limited role as the Governance and Audit Committee in relation to it. But I think there are some comments that that might be helpful. I think trying to marry reporting on the corporate plan with the wellbeing objectives and self-assessment, perhaps doesn't work. And for me, there's a lot of narrative in there, but it wasn't much about qualitative outcomes, and I think that's really what people want to see. And bearing in mind this is a public document, it needs to be fairly easy to read, and there needs to be a relationship between your corporate objectives, your wellbeing objectives, and your outcomes, because it's outcomes people are interested in, and I don't think there's enough data in there, and enough qualitative data, because at the end of the day, if you're raising skills, how have you raised skills? What impact has what you've done had on the skills level of the area? And one thing, again, this is just for consideration, bearing in mind Newport is probably the most multicultural county in Wales. I thought you underplayed the equality issue there. Now, I think it was sort of, you mentioned something like 4.9% of your staff are from BAME backgrounds. Now, I wondered, how did that relate to the actual community of Newport? Bear in mind this is a public document. I thought that we should make a bit more of that in it. And those are just comments I hope will be helpful.
Thank you for those comments. In terms of just specifically the equalities item, that we have work to do there. Our staff mix does not adequately reflect the communities we serve. Yeah. That is something that's in the Strategic Equalities Annual Report, but that is the kind of thing we can bring through. And I guess that's part of the challenge too, and many of these things are covered in other reports. If I go back to the scrutiny discussion, I know we're not at scrutiny, but there was a debate about how much air quality information was in there, but that's in a whole other report. And so there's a balance about regurgitating existing information as well, I think. But specifically on equalities, that is something we need to aim for.
I think so. It's a public document. It's your top-level document, isn't it? And that's the thing to remember. It's top high-level corporate objectives. What have you done? What impact have you had? Not how many NEETs there are. That's what people want to know. And actually, to be honest about where you failed as well.
Don and then Councillor Cox, but Don first.
First of all, I really appreciate the danger in trying to get a document like this and getting the balance right. In reading it, for me, the danger is sometimes it can become a self-promotion rather than self-assessment, and I think the balance is slightly wrong. and I almost think that as a committee we should recommend that it gets back and has a look at this, because I'm not sure that this format works for the council, and I don't think there's enough detailed evaluation in there that helps you as a working document going forward. And I think sometimes when when it skews over to self-promotion, it dilutes the effectiveness of the document and almost takes the shine off the great achievements that the council has done in a difficult situation. So for me, I think it's very difficult in terms of looking at the conclusions and the action plan. There isn't enough information that we can do that, and I just think the balance of the document is more self-promotion, and I just think that should be looked at.
Thank you. I think we take that comment on board. Self-reflection and that element of the Act is new to council, pushing us in that direction, and I think we recognise we've got more work to do there.
Okay. Councillor Cox.
Well, I think part of what I was going to say has been said, that it just the point that's been made about the need for more evaluation, and because there's a tremendous amount of description. I mean, actually, as a relatively, as a new councillor, I thought I'm going to keep this, because if I want to know what's going on in various parts of the council, it was an excellent document to describing what's taking place and projects are being undertaken, and a lot of the really work that's been done on the council was really well explained. But I also felt that sometimes, I'll illustrate the point in a similar vein, that I really wasn't quite sure about the sort of progress we were talking about. To illustrate this point, perhaps, is on page 52, with promoting economic growth. I mean, it just seems to me that one thing that's absolutely crucial to promote economic growth, and I don't think anybody would challenge it, would it, is an effective transport network. And I know that's quite a concern of the councils. And item 6 on page 52 in the pack talks about promoting fast, reliable public transport links in the city. But in terms of what progress has been made over that, or where we're going with that, I really just couldn't find anything. It actually did say that we've obviously got representatives who are involved in projects like the Burns Commission and etc. But just what practical difference it was making in terms of our transport links getting better or not, I really couldn't tease out from the report. So, then, I think it's making a point that's already been made. I'm sorry, but to go back to something I've raised before, and it's been raised again in terms of equality, that I took the advice I got at the last meeting, which is to go to the the strategic equality plan and look at the annual report. It was suggested I do, but I think for this committee, and I've probably pretty obvious from the previous meetings, that I do think this whole issue of equality is one that's really neglected in many areas of public service, and that the equality report, it is a lot of really excellent work being done in there, and in terms of this report that we're looking at today, there's a lot of really good stuff being done in terms of making people conscious of equality issues, in terms of ensuring that council policies promote equality, etc., etc. There's a lot of really very good work being done. But what I can't find anywhere is anywhere that just tells me if it's working. Because in my experience of equality is that getting the policies right and getting the right sort of attitudes amongst people is really important. But you never know if it's working or not until you actually do some monitoring. And I honestly couldn't find any monitoring where it had said, for example, I don't know that where there was a service where there'd been a really, robust monitoring exercise that actually came up with the conclusion that, yes, that each group, in terms of whatever, in terms of gender or age or ethnic background, was benefiting from this service in equal way, because here are the statistics that actually show that, and I've not found that anywhere in terms of the documentation. And some issues, again, in here are ones that seem to me really beg some real inquiry in terms of equality, because some of the issues in this report are ones where it's widely known across the whole of the country, actually, that there are disparities in the benefit those services are to different groups.
Shall I come back on equalities? I appreciate some of what you were talking about there was the Strategic Equalities Annual Report, but interestingly, there was some discussion on that report about being clearer on outcomes, and we have a member and officer group who are going to take that forward. Although I would say that I think there are quite a lot of outcomes in that report, but we have more work to do there too. I guess it's to what extent we reproduce that through this report. And I guess I have to say, because I've said it before, I think equalities is really important in public service, and it's one of the core values that the council operates within. We have staff groups who work with equalities on us. We've really progressed a lot of that work, but that is obviously the Strategic Equalities Annual Report. I thought it was covered in here, but I would have to do some work around in the COVID recovery. We did an extensive community impact assessment where we looked in detail about how different communities were impacted by COVID and how that might impede recovery. Very statistical piece of work, and actually our participatory budgeting work, which I think is covered, is a response to that and was aimed at those minority communities and the inequalities out there. Having said that, if the committee couldn't see that in the report, it shows that the report needs to be clearer on those points.
Well, I take all that on board, and I know it's a big organisation, there's a lot of issues to look at, I appreciate that. But, it says, for example, diverse staff have a voice within the organisation. The potential for unconscious bias in recruitment is recognised, etc. And I'm not the slightest doubt the policies are there, and I'm not the slightest doubt the awareness is there, but is that actually working? And are the figures there to show it's working? And unless somebody can point them out to me, I can't find that kind of data anywhere in the report. And I think it's just good equalities practice, actually, too. And I appreciate you can't go around not enough hours in the day for you, I'm not saying you personally, for the organisation, to monitor absolutely everything in that kind of detail on an ongoing basis. But, what does seem good practice is that there is a process by occasionally, people dip in different areas and actually do get some really hard stats, and I just can't find those.
Noted.
Because I think that's a problem with a lot of the report, actually, is we haven't got the qualitative information to actually show that what we're doing has led to an outcome, not an output, an outcome. And I think that's a theme, never mind the equality issue, I think that's the theme to the report, is we need qualitative data that we've actually had an impact from what we've been doing.
Councillor Harris.
On page 57, it's saying that only 15, the number of new businesses, startups supported through Business Development Fund was only 15. Is that because it was during the COVID period, or is that,
We've just got to be a bit careful here, because we're straying into issues which are not the remit of this committee.
Yeah.
Because we're here just to look at the self-assessment documentation and whether or not that reflects good self-assessment. I think some of the questions that are being raised should be raised at different forums. And I don't mean to be I don't want to cut you off, if you know what I mean.
I'm sure it's in another document somewhere else.
But I'm sure that the director will correct me if I'm wrong or right.
Yes, sorry, Chair. So just to say that, so obviously that's just an extract from information goes from the service area, service plan reviews that go through the performance scrutiny committees. If you want a response to that, we can get a response to you from the service area.
That would be useful, because it does look like a very small number compared to previous years.
I think that is covered in the report, actually, because it talks about the delays due to COVID. So I think that's the answer. Obviously, we can confirm, but that is one of the few questions you're asking that is actually covered in the report, I think.
Anyone comments? Don.
Just to comment on the report, is that because it's a live document, it's just in some areas it's got, like in the report, it refers to a bid deadline being the deadline being the 2nd of August. What happened? Did we put in a bid or did we not? And and elsewhere in the document says this will happen in September, but we're now October. I just wondered whether looking at that would make the report much stronger and more current. It just looks slightly obsolete in that area.
We can look at that, Chair. Obviously, it has reflected up until the end of March, but we don't want to speak in the wrong kind of timing in the language, so we can look at that. Thank you.
Are there any other comments? Just a couple from me. The document itself obviously is in draft form. It's not complete. It's got no leader forward. It's not got chief executive forward, which I think I would have liked to seen in the document, because obviously if we're looking at it as a whole, I don't know what the leader's going to say, and I actually don't know what the chief exec's going to say. But but that be that as may. I think the other thing is, and I understand whilst this is going to go online, an electronic document, if actually I picked it up in hard copy, there's lots of hyperlinks in there. So it's if I didn't have a computer and I didn't know how to do it, how would I link in? So I think it's just those technicalities for me. Not everyone. I'm not saying everyone's going to read this, but there are people out there who are shocked at it. Not everyone's got a computer, and not everyone thinks. So it's just maybe how do you address that? I think the debate this afternoon, for me, has indicated the possible confusion about merging the three plans together, because, again, some of the questions don't relate to the self-assessment, but they may well relate to the corporate plan. So there is that confusion for me. I don't think it's... If it's a self-evaluation and a self-assessment of the authority, I don't think it does enough self-evaluation. That's my opinion. I think there's certainly, there's a lot of verbiage in it. There's lots of discussion and debate in it, but there's very little, as I think Norma said, qualitative data, very few outcomes in regards to it. If there are key steps, then, if you take the one in regards to school outcomes, there's no information, there's no data in there. And if you look at the conclusions and the action plan as well, again, the recommendations there's actions there, but they're just statements of fact. And what I would be wanting to see is, look, what's the action plan behind it? Actually, what's going to come out of this? And, a simple one, I don't mean to be unkind here, new members have appropriate skills to effectively undertake their roles. Training and induction for new members will be reviewed and updated. That's just a statement of fact. So, what's going to be done? How are they going to be monitored? How's it going to be reviewed? New legislation comes into place, etc., etc. And, and a self-evaluation, I'm sure, in the old world, when I was in the sort of world of doing some of this, is, where were you in the past, where are you now, and where are you going to go forward? Lots of good self-promotion, but what stuff hasn't the council done very well? And I think the public need to know that, as well as everything it does extremely. Self-promotion of the council, I don't think is a bad thing, because the only time the council is in the newspaper is when it gets it wrong. Very little said about when the council actually does something really good. And I think there needs to be a balance, and it needs to be proportionate for me in moving forward. I don't think I've got anything else. So I think, you know, there's quite a lot of bits to be done. I understand it's the first iteration of this document. I think there is some work to be done corporately in regards to, do we do something different next year to ensure that we meet the demands of, you know, the regulatory framework under which we operate, but also then the well-being objectives, etc., etc. So that's from me in reality. I think hopefully there's been points picked up from the elected representatives. Hopefully you're not seen as too critical on this, but I think it's a learning exercise, and we all need to learn moving forward. And you know, some of the constructive discussion and debate we've had this evening hopefully will improve this in going forward.
Thank you, Chair. Appreciate those constructive comments. And we've also taken some feedback, which I meant to say earlier, from our trade unions and from other, if you like, interested bodies that it's really important we engage with. And we'll be looking to develop for next year, but we'll also obviously be capturing some of these comments for Cabinet, as you know.
And obviously, it's a statutory requirement. You do businesses, staff, trade unions, etc. But, you know, the time limit this year for delivering this was so compressed, it's unbelievable that councils are actually getting them out. But again, it's a learning exercise, you know, and to get proper feedback from the staff and trade, I don't know whether trade unions responded, but to get that feedback is very, very, and certainly the citizens of the county borough. So that's great, thank you. Rhys, do you want to try and capture something for us for a recommendation, subject to members agreeing, that is?
I've tried my best, so thanks very much for that. And as the Chair and Tracy have said, so this is the first year that we've tried to do this, and within some very challenging timescales as well. So that feedback's all fantastic, and really, you know, we'll support the promotion of this. So I've taken a series of comments, and I'm sure the team will include some of those within the minutes of the meeting. So I've written down 4 recommendations based off that, which you can agree or not agree, and I will change them in whichever way you see fit. So the first one, I think, Chair, was I think what I've read here there was that there will be a recommendation about reviewing the format of this report. Yeah.
Happy with that, looking at the format of this report rather than trying to put 3 of the requirements of this council into one document. It may mean you need to either split it off or make it very, you know, you may want one document but different sections, but let's leave that to the officers. Are you content with that, members? Yep.
Okay. So the second one is the report lacks detailed analysis and self-evaluation. Where possible, this should be rectified before finalisation. So we talked about the timescales of the statutory timescales of this. If not, it should be included within the next iteration of this report. So some things we're going to be able to get. I think some of those comments you made around some of the data's not in the report. I think those are reasonably straightforward. Some of it's going to be a bit more difficult to do. And just to clarify, because I know you mentioned at the beginning of this, these are recommendations that will go to Cabinet. Cabinet has to provide you with a response to those recommendations. So, you know, they will have to review these as part of that. So you will have a formal response back to that. So that was the second one.
The members happy with that? Yep.
Okay. Third one was the action should be developed further. Many are statements, not measurable actions.
I'm not sure whether Rhys has finished, but I'm not sure whether we've picked up the issue of linking the corporate objective and the well-being objective to the outcome that you've achieved. Is that coming up?
I'll put that down as a 5th.
Because that, to me, is important. It's
important,
the golden thread,
yeah.
Isn't it? It's, you know, we've committed to this. This is what we've done. This is the impact.
How we delivered it.
The outcome.
Or haven't we delivered it? Yeah.
I'm just writing that down quickly. We can agree some words. Now, I did actually write it down in my comments. I didn't put it down as a recommendation. So that was the third one. The fourth one is conclusions need to be based on an assessment of what hasn't worked as well as what has worked. Yeah, there needs to be a balance to the evaluative aspects of the report.
Yeah, I think it has to be balanced and proportionate. You know, you can't have self-promotion and all the good stuff. There is bad stuff, and I think, you know, the elected members really need to know about that as well, because, you know, that's the way a council improves. It's that continuous improvement agenda, isn't it? So, you know, you may focus all your efforts on the good things, but we're forgetting about those that are not so good and may need some improvement. Are you happy? Yep. Are you content with that? Not happy, but you're content. Sorry,
yeah,
Councillor.
I've just, I don't know how I'm going to phrase that, but with respect, I'm not sure I wanted to say bad stuff. There's some areas are going better than others, and
well, areas of improvement, they may need to be significant improvement or some improvement, but I don't. Thank you, Councillor Cox. Maybe the wrong words for me.
What I've said in the recommendation is things that haven't worked as well as those that have worked well. Yeah.
Well, you know, it'd be. I think we'd have the world flood into our gates here, wouldn't we, if Newport Council didn't have anything that wasn't going quite as well as you know, that's the nature of the world, isn't it, you know?
Norma.
Chair, I think it's, sorry, things come into my head. I think it's really important in this report that we give people a real sense that we're looking at ourselves and we know who we are. And, you know, there are challenges and, you know, it's difficult for the staff. They're working in difficult times. You know, this is what we didn't do so well. This is why, and this is what we plan to do. And you know, people want to read a simple, clear report. You know, that there are clear threads to it and clear explanations. I don't think they want, there are a lot of statements in there that are waffle. You know, sorry, for a better word. But I read it and I think, what does that actually mean? You know, people just want simple stuff where they can see what's being delivered and what the challenge is.
If I can just add to that, you know, obviously, presumably, you know, in terms of community engagement, we want this to be a document that's accessible, isn't it? And to be quite frank, I don't know how long it took other people, but to sit down and read it took me, I don't know, it took me at least 2 hours or something. And there aren't many members of the public going to do that. And that's a shame because there is a lot of really good stuff going on. And the danger maybe is it doesn't get read about because the document is so big and unwieldy in some ways.
Thank you, Councillor Cox. Can you make note of that? It took Councillor Cox 2 hours just to read this report, Director.
Noted.
Sorry, I digress.
I've put the fifth down. I don't know. I'll check if I worded this. So there needs to be a clear link between the corporate plan and wellbeing objectives and the outcomes being achieved. Is that about right? So that was those were the 5 things, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Anyone else? No. So you've heard Councillor Horton. Come on. Okay, you've heard the recommendation that those matter be referred to Cabinet as the recommendations of this committee. There are some comments which obviously will be fed up as well to Cabinet, and Cabinet either accept them, is my understanding, or they actually write back to us and say this is the reason why we're not accepting them this year. But I don't know, they may say something, so we'll wait and see. Okay, someone prepared to move, please? Thank you, Norma. Someone prepared to second? Thank you. Anyone against? No, thank you, that's carried. Item 6 then, we've got the Treasury Management Report. Rob?
Thank you, Chair. Hopefully everyone can hear me. So yeah, obviously you've got a copy of the report. I'll just run through the sort of key points and then take any questions at the end. So this report. So we report twice a year at the moment on Treasury management activities. It's a requirement of SITFA's Treasury Management Code. The frequency of reporting will actually increase next year to quarterly, but at the moment it's twice a year. The report ultimately goes to full council, so from this committee it goes to Cabinet and then to full council, and the same happens with the year-end report. So where we are now, this is the half-yearly position, so it sets out our position in terms of our borrowing, our investment levels, and critically our adherence with prudential indicators that we will have set as part of our capital and treasury management strategy for the year. And Appendix B of the report gives details around those prudential indicators. Also, just to sort of give a bit of context, the report does contain an overview of our general strategy and approach to managing our treasury functions. In essence, what we aim to do is to maximise what we call internal borrowing, i.e. we maximise the use of our existing cash resources before we commit to externally borrow, because obviously external borrowing comes with an interest cost, and in the current climate that's an increasing interest cost. So that's the kind of overview of the report. In terms of the specifics, so there's a section in the report on borrowing, so it identifies the fact that our external borrowing has reduced by £1.5 million at the halfway point of the year. That's mainly because we're making constant repayments in relation to what we call EIP loans. They're loans that you pay off as you go along. And also we have redeemed a couple of smaller loans. So our total borrowing now stands at £140.6 million. And we're also not anticipating any new borrowing for the remainder of this financial year. In terms of our investments, that's the other side of the equation. They've reduced by £8.3 million throughout the first half of the year, but critically that is to be expected. So in line with our internal borrowing strategy, we will reduce our investments down to a particular level. We won't go below 10 million because we need to retain 10 million balance to gain a certain status in terms of our borrowing capacity. But actually, we're nowhere near that at the moment. Total investments are currently 50 million, and by the end of the year, we're currently anticipating them being in the region of about 20 million. The reason that investment balances are higher than we say our minimum should be, but also that we would expect in a normal year, is that we're still holding quite a lot of the grant money that Welsh Government, in particular, issued during the pandemic. So a lot of grant money came our way at the end of last year. We've still got flexibility to actually spend that during this year. So we're holding those cash balances, but also at the same time our progress with delivering the capital programme, as is often the case, but perhaps more so at the moment, is not as quick as we would have anticipated. So we're not using those cash balances as quickly as we might have thought, which is good in a sense because that defers our need to borrow. There is a section in the report which just talks about a particular aspect of our investment strategy, which is to do with long-term investments. So at the moment, all of our investments are very short-term, matter of days in most cases that those investments are redeemable. In 2021, there was a budget-saving proposal where we were going to look into longer-term investments and ultimately higher yield in investments through, in the main, pooled funds. We haven't done that, and that's mainly because at the point that that proposal was agreed, the pandemic began. It didn't seem logical to tie money up for the long term because we didn't know if we might need it at that point. But also, I guess there was a risk as well in terms of not knowing what the economic picture would look like during the pandemic. So actually, for the last 2 years, and continuing into this year, we've kept all of our investments short term, but we've been able to hit that target, that increased income target, because we've had such a high level of investment, and obviously in the very recent past, interest rates have increased, so we're getting a better return on those investments as well. So we're not committing to those longer term investments at this point. It's been agreed internally that won't happen until at least next financial year at the earliest, partly because we don't need to achieve that income target, but also because there's the statutory aspect to do with an accounting technicality where currently there's a statutory override in place, which means that if we were to make those long-term investments and there was a capital depreciation, if that statutory override is not in place, we have to take the hit at that point, i.e. it impacts upon the council taxpayer. So there's a consultation running at the moment in terms of whether that override will be extended. Once we know whether that is or isn't being extended, we know whether it's sensible to go into these investments or not. So that's in there. I know I've dwelled on that point quite a bit there, but that's because it's technically a budget saving that's unachieved from a previous year, but it is being mitigated at the moment. I mentioned at the outset that the Treasury Management Code requires us from next year to report more frequently on Treasury management activities. It also requires us to include within our reports the liability benchmark indicator. We've actually taken the step to start including that now, because just because it doesn't have to come until next year, we're free to bring it in earlier if we want to. So within the report, you'll see there's a graph called the liability benchmark. And in essence, what that does is kind of give you a longer-term picture of our capital spend, our existing borrowing and how that will diminish as we repay loans, and then a gap basically between that needs to be filled by long-term borrowing, external borrowing. So it gives us an indication of when we might need to borrow, how much we might need to borrow, and that obviously assists us with our financial planning, because obviously borrowing comes with an interest cost that we need to ultimately fund through the revenue budget. So you'll see that is in there for the first time. What it broadly suggests is that we'll need to undertake some borrowing towards the end of next financial year, most likely. That's partly because we'll need to redeem and refinance loans that are going to be repaid during that year, but also because, as in line with our capital programme, we are expecting to increase our capital expenditure. So spend is going one way, existing borrowing is going the other way, so there's that gap that needs to be filled. There's also a section we've included, mainly because of the economic context that we're in at the moment and the uncertainty around the outlook. So I've said already that whilst we have an underlying need to borrow longer term, we don't have an imminent need to borrow. And because of that, that means we are somewhat protected against the interest rate increases that are going on at the moment. All of our loans are fixed interest rate loans, so we don't have any variable loans. However, having said that, we do have about £30 million worth of LOBOs, which are lender option, borrower option loans. Basically, the way those loans work is that periodically there's an interval at which the lender can vary the interest rate. At that point, we have the option as the borrower to say, well, actually, we want to repay that loan. We don't want the revised rate. The issue we have is that, at the moment, some of those lenders could think, oh, well, actually, we will change the rate because we can increase it in line with rates. We may not have an option but to accept that rate, because actually the alternative is that we'd have to find alternative borrowing anyway, which could be at the same rate or even higher. So, touch wood, that hasn't happened so far, but that is a possibility in the economic climate that we're in at the moment. But just as a general point, our Treasury advisors are saying hold off undertaking any new borrowing if you can, because their forecast is that rates will ultimately stabilise and probably drop down. Not drop down to the kind of low levels that we would have seen over the last few years, but lower than they are now. And at the moment, we can afford to do that, because we don't think we'll need to undertake any borrowing until the end of next financial year. So that's the main body of the report. In terms of the appendices, there's two appendices. Appendix A just provides some context. That part of the report is provided by our external Treasury advisors. So that's something that they nationally produce. And obviously it's particularly relevant at the moment. But having said that, it's already out of date, because obviously things are changing so rapidly at the moment. For example, it doesn't take account of another change in Prime Minister and economic policy. And then Appendix B just gives the details. It gives more information about our local context, and as I said earlier, it includes our performance to date against prudential indicators. As it says in the report, we are complying with all indicators currently except one, but it's a bit of a strange one, and it's strange in the sense that we're not complying with it. So basically it's to do with our exposure to interest rate changes, and because perversely we're holding such high level of investments, we are therefore exposed more so to interest rate changes. But actually at the moment, as I said, we're doing quite well with our investments. We're achieving over targets. So whilst we are exposed in a climate of increasing interest rates, that's fine, because actually we're doing better. Of course, if interest rates were to drop, we may not be able to hit our income targets, but that's not a concern for this year as things currently stand. Okay, so that's the report. Any questions?
Yeah, thank you, Rob. Sorry, are there any questions? Norma?
Thank you, Chair. First of all, just to say, I thought it was a really good paper, and it gave me confidence in terms of Treasury management of the authority. And it was good to see that net borrowing has decreased, not by a great amount, but it has. One thing, two questions. First of all, loans to developers at 10.6 million. Bearing in mind we had a major construction company go into administration last week that affected properties in the Newport area as well as other areas. How secure is that money? Are we likely to get that repaid?
Yeah, so in terms of the loans to developers, so there's so the 10 million is spread across a few developers. So to give an example, the developer of the market, so that's obviously a recent development that's taken place, the council extended loan finance to that particular developer. All loans are secured well, in a number of different ways, but ultimately, yes, we would ensure that in any loan agreement there is ultimately security. Some security is easier to enact than others, but we would always try and ensure that there is security there. So, you know, until the loan gets repaid, I can't say 100% that they will, because, you know, as you've just given the example, you know, companies can go bust, you know, things can happen, but we can satisfy ourselves as much as we practically can that we have got security in place, and if it really came to it, we could enact that security.
That's good. My second question, and I need some explanation around this. Borrowing is currently at 140.6 million, and then you mentioned the max you've got is 141.9 million. I think this is on page 119, and then you've got a borrowing headroom of 2.391. So, first question: are we going to exceed that 141.9? Because there's not much difference from where we are now to what you call is your max. And how does that relate to the headroom?
Okay, so I presume you're referring to the operational boundary?
Yeah, it's table 4 on page 119.
Yeah, so basically there are two authorisation limits which are required as sort of standard in terms of indicators. So one is called the authorised limit. That is the absolute maximum borrowing we can have at any single point in time. You then have the operational boundary, which is effectively our cap in terms of borrowing that we can undertake to finance our capital programme. So the difference between those two is to allow for the fact that on a day-to-day basis, we might need to undertake some short-term borrowing just to manage cash flow requirements. Let's say we were due a big grant payment from Welsh Government in a couple of days' time, but we had the payroll running the day before. We just needed to make sure there was enough cash in the bank basically to do that. So that's the difference between those two limits. In terms of the borrowing headroom, that is more to do with borrowing that we have allowed for in our capital programme, but that it hasn't been allocated to a specific scheme. So if we were looking, for example, at the capital monitoring reports which Cabinet receive, you would see a long list of schemes, all the different things that the Council are investing in. But at the bottom of that, you would see borrowing headroom. So that's basically funding that we've committed to inputting into the programme. So it's captured within the operational boundary total, but that we haven't actually allocated to a specific scheme. So it is a bit of a difficult concept to get your head around, because when we look at the capital programme, we talk about funding sources and we say that borrowing is a funding source. Technically speaking, that's not correct. Borrowing is a form of cash flow management. Anything that's funded through borrowing in the capital programme is technically unfunded, because then over a period of time we pay for it through the revenue account. So, you know, without wanting to make this a training session, it's a concept that's quite important ultimately to try and understand. But yeah, so that's basically the difference. Is our operational boundary is all about actual cash borrowing. Our borrowing headroom is more about funding that we've committed towards a programme that we haven't allocated on a specific scheme. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it's very clear.
If not, let me know.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Councillor Jordan, I see you've got your hand up, and then I'll come to Councillor Mogford.
Thank you, Chair. Just one question. Thanks for the report. It's a good explanation. I was just looking at on the grant. You're holding the grant money. How much of the grant money are we holding? And if we don't use it, where will it be actually? Where will it go? Where will it be absorbed to?
Okay, so I can't right now give a figure in terms of the value of the grants that we're holding, because you know, that's more of a theme, if you like, as to why we're holding so much cash. But yeah, if required, I could try and get that figure. In terms of repaying those grants, all grants that we accept will have terms and conditions that we sign up to. and they will always have a defined timescale during which we have to use that funding. What happened quite a lot in certainly the last financial year, but also the one before, is Welsh Government had a need towards the end of the financial year to basically get money out of their door, otherwise they have to pay it back. So what they came up with, and this is all public, this isn't me betraying any confidence, is the fact that they would give us money in 1 year to effectively displace the funding that we'd already committed to using in that particular year, on the basis that we would then use the money that we had earmarked in the following year to use on the Welsh Government's initiative. So what that basically means is we were given money at the end of last financial year for spend that we had already incurred, and then we had this year to actually get on and spend that money on the purposes that they wanted us to. So that's why we're still holding a lot of those balances, because we are now using them in this financial year for the purposes for which Welsh Government intended that money. So I hope that gives an explanation. Like I said, I can try and get a figure of how much of that grant funding we received late last year we still haven't spent. Yeah, I could do that. It would take a bit of time, but we can do that if that's what the committee require. But yeah, hopefully that gives the explanation as to what happens if we don't spend it. We will ultimately, if we don't spend it and the time elapses, we would theoretically have to repay it.
Yeah, great, thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Jordan. Councillor Mogford.
The question I would like to ask is, why is it so complicated? But I'm not going to. You mentioned a lot about investments and return on investments, and that's obviously critical to the council that we do invest. What's the take on ethical investments, if I can leave it as simple as that?
Yeah, you're right. This is a theme that's becoming more and more prominent. Unsurprisingly, it's the theme everywhere, isn't it? So one thing we are, I think we've got it in the report somewhere, is we're quite clear that we are not directly investing in any Russian investments. So that's the first point. But yeah, ESG is a wider consideration now. So something we are trying to progress with our Treasury advisors is an understanding of how our money, in terms of where our money goes and ultimately where it goes, because you can have direct investments, but then you have indirect investments. So we are, and our Treasury advisor, doing everything we can to understand that. And clearly, if there was something that we weren't comfortable with, then we potentially not invest in those areas. There has been nothing to date brought to our attention that suggests we are investing in something unethical. But it is something we are pushing forward with. So just to give an example, I talked about Russia, but to give another example, as part of our climate change agenda, and we're looking at environmental investments. So we're looking at our own cash investments that we make, and direct and indirect as much as we can, and looking at the policies that each investment fund have around ethical investments, but also in terms of the pension fund, we're also asking questions around the pension fund's investments. Obviously, that's done on a regional basis to ensure that they're ethical as well. So yeah, it's very much on the it's in our minds and on our agenda in terms of understanding where our money's ultimately going. Okay.
It was a question which carries on from what Councillor Mogford kind of alluded to. There is a lot of information in the document, and I'm not saying I'm one of them, but people do struggle to understand the context and the contents. Would it be possible to because obviously this is going to go to full council, and would it be possible to have this sort of simplified so the salient points are highlighted, so that if there is anything which is very important, it's made quite clear to us, so that we're not looking at 30 pages, for example, of words and numbers, and everybody just goes, I don't really understand this, so I'm just going to say, yeah, I agree with it, just so that it can be sort of simplified a little.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, because obviously
I'm not saying change the document, keep the document as it is, but maybe add a 1 or 2 pager, which makes the quite important points and people can understand, even if it's something as simple as a few traffic lights.
Okay. I think what we probably can do is look at the summary section of the report, because obviously there's a summary section at the beginning which gives a very brief overview. clearly it needs to remain a summary, but there might be, we might be able to draw some of the more key points into that report. But yeah, we are ultimately guided to some extent by the Treasury Management Code, so it's difficult to get away from the detail that's required. It is naturally a very technical area. Most accountancy staff wouldn't have a huge amount of knowledge in this area. It's quite niche as well. So, thank you for the feedback. We'll take that on board and see what we can do to try and draw out those key themes. Like I said, it is difficult because we are somewhat limited and guided in terms of what we have to report and how we report it. But yeah,
my main point really is that we will look at this and we will all just go, do you agree with this? And everybody will go, yeah, I agree with this. It makes sense. But people will just be saying that because they don't want to turn around and say, I really don't get this. It's just going straight off my head.
No, point taken on board. And like I said, I'll see if we can introduce something that kind of brings those key points together as part of the report. That's fine.
Councillor Harris.
In effect, having an executive summary.
Yeah, well, there is obviously the summary section of the report, but if that's not quite, you're probably looking for something somewhere in between, I guess. It's not, literally a one or two liner, but equally not the full report. So, like I said, that's something I'll take away, and we'll have a reflection as to how we can possibly add in something that pulls those key points together.
Councillor Cox.
Yeah, can I ask a question? I don't know if this is explained somewhere in the report, but on page 108 of the pack, it talks about the ability to use further internal borrowing will diminish, with internal borrowing reducing over time as cash reserves are utilised. I mean, I understand what it's saying, but that the two issues that I don't really understand is that that cash reserves will diminish. I mean, I don't know. It doesn't really explain in detail why does it in the report. I don't think, unless I've missed that out. And then clearly there's a great emphasis in the report on, or it's strongly recommended to councils that internal borrowing is used because it's a much more efficient way of financing a council. Well, if there's less opportunity to do that, if you haven't got the reserves to do that, that's clearly going to have quite a significant impact on the council's budget, presumably, in terms of what the council's able to do.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. So in terms of use of reserves, when we say reserves will diminish, it's because basically all reserves are earmarked for a specific purpose. So ultimately, over a period of time, those reserves will be used for their intended purpose. So to give an example, the council holds a sizable reserve to do with its PFI schemes because they're paid for over a number of years. So each year that reserve will be whittled down as we pay for the PFI scheme. So that's all that's really referring to is the fact that we plan to use reserves. Like I said, they're held for a specific purpose. Generally, most of them will be planned to be used over a fairly short time frame. Doesn't always happen because, as we've seen in the last couple of years, we get more money late in the year and we don't end up having to use reserves perhaps as planned. So that's kind of hopefully addressed the first point in terms of, we're not sort of being reckless in the use of reserves. This is exactly what they're planned for. But as we use them, we spend the cash that backs them. In terms of once the internal borrowing capacity is diminished, yes, we will have to undertake external borrowing. That will come with a hefty cost. And that interest cost is ultimately borne by the revenue budget. We will plan for that. So within our medium-term financial plan, we will plan for the fact that we may need to increase the interest payable budget to account for that. But also, it's also important to note that some of our existing loans are at quite high interest rates because they were taken out, I think some of them were taken out in the mid-90s, very, very long term, much higher interest rates. So actually, some of the new borrowing we undertake may be cheaper than the borrowing that we're currently paying for. So it's not always guaranteed that new borrowing equals more pressure on the revenue budget. It can do, and if there's an overall growth in the amount of borrowing needed, that will inevitably happen. But in some cases, particularly where we're refinancing existing loans, actually it may be cheaper to get a new loan, or the rate at the new loan may be cheaper than the the existing loans, so there may be a saving as well. So it's a bit of a balancing act, and that's why we have to monitor it carefully and make sure that if there is a net movement, that's reflected in the medium-term financial plan.
Councillor Mogford.
Just a point of clarification on something you said. Is it the case then that reserves are actually ring-fenced?
Yeah, so earmarked reserves are ultimately, we have a general reserve, so the general reserve is there as the kind of point of last resort if the council got into real financial difficulty, but all other reserves have to be earmarked for a specific purpose. So if you were to look at the council statement of accounts, you would see an analysis that shows a breakdown of all the different reserves, and the number of reserves is growing and growing, and all the different reasons that they're held for. So yeah, in effect, I wouldn't say they're ring-fenced, but they are earmarked for a specific purpose. There are some exceptions which are ring-fenced by statute. So, for example, civil parking, any surpluses on civil parking have to be held in a ring-fence reserve, cannot be used for any other purpose other than to invest in highway infrastructure, for example. But yeah, all other reserves are earmarked, which means we can technically repurpose them, but if we do that, we're then not fulfilling the purpose for which they were originally intended. You know, that may be in support of a cabinet initiative, it may be to guard against a specific risk that the council is facing. So they're not ring-fenced generally, but they are earmarked. So hopefully that helps explain that point.
Okay, are there... Oh.
I'm hoping the answer to this question is going to be one word. Right? So save your voice. On page 110, it's got in the comments of the Chief Financial Officer, it just says, in the events of circumstances changing rapidly, I have delegated authority to borrow as needed. My question is that if that delegated action is taken, will that be reported back to the committee at the earliest opportunity?
We haven't borrowed for a while, but yeah, it would be factored into a report. We wouldn't necessarily bring a specific report to say that we have undertaken. So let's say, I think the next committee is January, and there's no Treasury Management report due. We wouldn't, as a matter of course, notify the committee or cabinet, or that we'd undertaken new borrowing, for the very reason that it is a delegated responsibility to the Section 151 officer to manage those cash flows. But it would ultimately be reported in the next report, and obviously when we get into next financial year, we will be reporting more frequently. It will probably coincide with the committee cycle anyway. So by virtue of that, you would get a notification at the next earliest opportunity in a public arena anyway.
That's great, thank you.
Okay, if there are no other questions or comments, I think we've given this a good airing again. We are here only looking at the assurance that the council's got its treasury management under control. But I think what's come to light here tonight, again, if you go back to your self-assessment report and member training, there's a little bit of member training needed for treasury management. And there's an opportunity to publish a book, which I use quite regularly, a Dummy's Guide to Treasury Management, because I think that would be quite useful, because as you say, Robert, it's very technical. And I think, Councillor Horton's point is valid, really, is that if anyone can simplify it, that would be a great use to elected members, because otherwise, it's like wading through treacle, really. But thank you, Rob, for presenting that. We've got the recommendation, firstly, to note the report on Treasury Management activities during the first half-year period of 22-23 and offer Governance Committee the opportunity to provide feedback on the situation in subsequent report. I don't think there's any other feedback to go back. I think, you've been complimented on the report, and I think we just note the report. Someone prepared to move, please? Thank you, Councillor Mogford. Can I have a seconder? Councillor Harris. Anyone against? No? Thank you very much. Thank you for that, Rob. You can go if you wish. Item 7 then is the internal audit progress against audit plan 22-23, quarter 2. Andrew?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, this is the one of the regular reports I'll be bringing into Governance and Audit Committee. It's based on the performance of the team and the progress we've made in terms of audit opinions issued up to quarter 2, which is the 30th of September 2022, in relation to financial year 22-23. So 2 key areas, performance of the team and assurance with the audit opinions which we've issued. We have started doing site visits again so we can cover more of the audit plan than we have recently, which is good news. Just to remind committee that the audit plan is based on 1,073 audit days, and in response to members' concerns previously about receiving more timely information about unsatisfactory reports, I've also incorporated further details about one of our unsatisfactory reports which we reported in Q1, which is the passenger transport unit taxi contracts audit, which had a consecutive unsatisfactory opinion. So there's more details within the report, and I'll come to that in a sec. But for the purposes of this afternoon's meeting, members are requested to note the report that will be presented by me now, and also to consider calling in the strategic director and head of service in relation to the second consecutive unsatisfactory audit opinion for the PTU taxi contracts based on the information I'll go through in a sec. In terms of the performance of the team, if I can refer members to paragraph 12, target for Q2 is 30%. We've achieved 31% of the plan. Issuing the report on a timely basis is also key, and we're getting draft reports out within 3 days compared to a target time of 10, and final reports issued within 2 days against a target time of 5. More details are shown in the appendix, and more comparisons are shown in the appendix as well, Chair. Moving on to audit opinions, we've got details of those in the appendix, which I'll come to in a moment. But we've issued 28 jobs to draft report stage at the end of Q2, 10 of which warranted an audit opinion. 1 was good, 8 were reasonable, 1 was unsatisfactory. And just to bring to members' attention, the unsatisfactory did relate to the PTU taxi contracts. That was a follow-up, and it had a second consecutive unsatisfactory opinion, details of which I'll come to in one moment. If I could just refer members to Appendix A, that details the performance of the team on a year-by-year basis and a quarter-by-quarter basis. For 22-23, we're looking at the highlighted table and the highlighted column towards the right-hand side, and there are a number of other performance indicators there as well, which we're there or thereabouts on. In terms of Appendix B, there's a summary of the opinions which we've issued, and also a bit more detail in terms of the actual audit job which we've undertaken, separated and organised into good, reasonable or unsatisfactory opinions, and also included are the grant claim work which we've undertaken, which is unqualified. Appendix C refers to the added value work that we get involved with in terms of financial advice, financial regulations training, input into a new financial system, but also the collation of the annual governance statement. Appendix D gives a definition of what opinions we use, and that's how the opinions have developed within the previous appendix. So coming on to the details of the unsatisfactory, the consecutive second unsatisfactory within PTU taxi contracts, that's shown on Appendix E. Overall, we had 11 significant issues, 5 moderate issues. There are no critical weaknesses, but in the report are the lists of significant and moderate issues which we picked up going through the report. We test against expected controls, and these are weaknesses which we've identified in the report. There were strengths, but these are the weaknesses. And where the weaknesses outweigh the strengths, then that leads to an unsatisfactory audit report. This is a follow-up report, Chair, so this has resulted in a second consecutive unsatisfactory audit opinion. So hence the recommendation for members this afternoon. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Andrew. Any questions, please? Councillor Horton.
With obviously it's another good report. When you're having to go back and look at the unsatisfactories, is that going to Or do you have a view yet of whether or not that's going to impact on your ability to complete the rest of your audits?
Okay, so it depends on timing. So if we've identified an unsatisfactory report towards the end of the financial year, then we can build that into the audit plan for the following financial year. So the answer will be no, it won't impact because we'll already account for that in the audit plan. If we are identifying unsatisfactory reports really late in the year, then that could impact on our ability to cover our plan. And we have to take a judgment call on whether we do audit planned work or a follow-up work.
Norma?
Thank you, Chair. I mean, it's good to see that the audit function is working well. I just had one question on paragraph 8 of the main report. I just wondered whether we were saying there that there is a lack of cooperation of service managers and staff that has prevented completion of the previous year's audit reports. I think there were 13 of them that weren't completed at the end of the year. And the other question I asked, I was a bit concerned that only 80% of the audit reports are reasonable, 8 out of 10. I think only one was good. And I just wondered whether there are any themes coming from these audit reports, because I'd like to see 80% good, not 80% reasonable, but there are any themes coming out that leadership in the authority would need to be addressing? Because my guess, from what I've seen, there are themes.
Okay, thank you, Chair. In terms of the first comment, that's just a general statement for us as an audit team to make you aware that it's not straightforward. It's not an exact science in terms of auditing, but we do need the cooperation of the service managers to enable us to do our work effectively. If we come across any concerns, that's generally escalated to me, or we escalate it to a head of service. But generally, service managers are pretty responsive to us, and we've developed good relationships. In terms of the second point, I'd love to see all goods. That would be great.
Sorry?
I would love to see all goods in terms of my opinions which I issue. It's difficult to tie that together because of the range of work which we do. We cover all service areas. We now have 11 service areas across the organisation. And because of the cycle of work, we're probably auditing things once every 8 or 9 years at the moment. So it's difficult to compare like with like when we're doing those audits. We've got a general theme which we run through in terms of expected controls in key areas, but that changes from audit to audit. So we've looked at trying to identify themes before. It's not straightforward, but we will take on board your comment and we will consider that moving forward.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Councillor Cox?
Yeah, it was a comment probably rather than a question. We're talking about the whole report now, are we? I'm going to talk particularly about the issue over the over taxes.
Yeah, we're talking about the whole report at the moment.
Yeah.
But obviously, if you've got a question, great. If not, I'll open it for unless there's no other questions. Got a question, Don?
Just referring to paragraph 20, Andrew, where it talks in terms of financial training, with it being mandatory, and I guess it's how mandatory is mandatory training, and how is it monitored, and does everyone work on the same definition of the word mandatory?
I think in reverse, probably not. We'd like to think that it is mandatory. We, as much as we can, we encourage people to attend. We encourage people in key areas to attend. We've agreed with HR that it should be mandatory. I think there was some confusion last time around in terms of the self-nomination comment. We've reflected on that and changed it in this report. The self-nomination means if your manager says you need to go on the training, you self-nominate to get on the training. So that's just a process, really. We don't effectively monitor that as well as we could do. So that could be looked into and developed further. But if I could just go back to the comment about the themes, Donna's got a contribution she'd like to make.
Yeah, just on the common themes, we have picked up some common themes across the audits, and we fed that back to HR. Some of them included the mandatory training, which we were picking up in all our audit reviews. There was also issues around register of business interests, so declarations of interest weren't being completed by teams. Off the top of my head, I can't remember the other, but we have fed that back to HR. But like Andrew said, you know, most audits, they're all different, so we won't always have those common themes coming out.
Thanks, Chair. And in terms of the mandatory side of things, it's something we look at in all audits. So as well as providing the training, we also make sure there's compliance with policy, and we make sure that staff have attended mandatory training, which includes financial regulations as well as others. So we kind of monitor it on a very local level, but we don't monitor it on a corporate level.
Rhys?
Thanks. I think this came up in the last meeting, and Tracy might want to say something about this. So we've invested in a new system, Meta Compliance, which gives us a much better grip of, essentially, if you're supposed to be doing mandatory training, you have to do the mandatory training. It takes you down that route, and then we've got a log of it as well. Yeah, essentially.
Yeah, it's very new. It's only just rolling out, but we've invested in it, and that's something we'll use to take that forward and have better records from that.
I think it could be something that we could get reflected in a report in due course as to, you know, numbers of people who should be attending, numbers who don't attend in the directorate, so that the management team can be made aware of that, because it's important, and it was raised in the last meeting as well. Okay, Councillor Cox.
I did have one quick question, please, just for clarification. The issue over taxes, we're talking about here taxes that are actually contracted by the council to carry particular people around, are we? And as well as taxes which are being used by the general public. We're talking about both? Or we're just talking about one of those?
Just the former. So it's taxis we contract with to provide service for the authority, not general taxi licensing.
Right, okay.
Okay, any other questions? Can I just ask one question before we come in with your comments? Andrew, in regards to the PTU, there are no critical issues here. You know, what actually do you define? I know it's what's defined in this document here as no critical weaknesses were identified. When you look at some of the significant concerns, one of the critical things for me, and again this probably is a matter of interpretation, is that you've got a taxi operator operating a taxi for this council who's using unlicensed drivers. Now, if that isn't critical, because we're dealing presumably with some of the most vulnerable young people in the county borough, some who've got severe medical needs or whatever needs, and that's not a critical issue. So I just need to have explained to me what's the threshold for being critical, given the background of this and the young people it's carrying.
Thanks, Chair. So how we determine critical, significant and moderate is noted in the report. It is subjective. It is based on the evidence we've got at the time when we do the audit. It does go through a quality review process. So it is an expected control, weakness or strength. And then if it's identified as a strength, the auditor will determine whether it's a critical or significant moderate weakness. That then goes through a management review process. So we kind of have got an understanding of what that means across all services and all the audits we undertake across the authority, and the impact that could have corporately, basically. So we take that into consideration. It is subjective, but we do have that kind of quality review process when it's determined.
The concern I have, and I thank you for that response, is that if a taxi turns up outside a house for a young person with an unlicensed driver who could be whatever, a convicted criminal, etc., etc. You've got no control over it whatsoever. And my view would be if that got into the press or something happened to that young person, that would be a critical issue for the council, and it shouldn't, we should be put in place. I understand it's objective, but, this is an issue where we're dealing with vulnerable young people, because that's the reason why you're providing a taxi driver, presumably with an escort, who also needs to be DBS checked, and the young person themselves. So I understand that, but in some of these instances, I think there needs maybe a balance, because again, there are other issues in here about, details of taxi drivers, escorts were not always provided at the school. So, no one knows who's going to turn up and pick them up, and that could be, other people. And 210, taxi escorts, were not required to submit any form of photo identification. So, you could get an approval, but Joe Bloggs could turn up. For me, this is quite appalling from a child safeguarding issue, and I think I'm not going to preempt what the committee's going to say, but my view is we call these people in, the director and the head of service, to be called to account for some of this, because this is absolutely, in my mind, quite appalling way of operating a service to the most vulnerable young people of this county borough. Sorry. Norma.
Chair, I just want to endorse that, because when I read this, that was the word that occurred to me. This is appalling, in terms of the risks to young people and the risks to the reputation of the local authority. Huge, huge risk to the reputation if something went wrong. And what struck me was actually there were simple administrative tasks anyone could do. It wasn't as if it was difficult work, which we had referred to this morning, earlier, in relation to adoption allowances. That sounds as if that was a little bit more complex. But this is simple administrative tasks that are not being done or not being done properly. So I really feel very strongly that we should call in the strategic director and the head of service there.
Thanks, Jay. I totally agree with you, and that's why we've raised them in the audit report. I mean, I think your comments are very valid, but I'm not the audience you need to talk to those comments about. We're picking them up in terms of the audit report to make the service manager aware, to make the head of service aware. They need to be addressed.
I understand that, Andrew. You're at the end of the sausage machine here. You're presenting this, and we haven't got the people who actually should be in the room being accountable and answering questions on it. So, subject to what committee says, that's what will happen next time, I hope. Councillor Mogford.
Yes, I agree with Norma. I just wanted to endorse what you said. I think it's probably more serious, perhaps, than you consider, because would an unlicensed driver be insured? And in which case, would even minor incidents, not criminal as such, an accident or something, make the council liable for damages to, it's quite appalling, really. And just on that note then, I guess, I mean, in terms of the grading that you give, and you said it's subjective, is there a bias to go down in severity? I mean, are you conscious that you don't want to be too critical? Because someone else might be a lot more critical than you, for example. So,
okay, I think in my role, I'm not afraid of being critical, as I've probably demonstrated over the years. No, we kind of do take it in the rounds. We do take it seriously, but it's our job. We assess this across the board in all kind of weaknesses and strengths that we identify, and there's certainly no bias. But I accept the fact that you think it's serious. We think it's serious. That's why we put it in the report. It's just it's a determination. It's in the report. Okay, it's not critical. We said it's significant. Your view is it might be it's critical. It's in the report. It needs to be addressed.
I agree with that, and I take on board what Councillor Mogford says. We're not questioning you or your team's integrity, and it is subjective. So, you see a lot more of these than we do. In my own mind, as I said, I consider it to be extremely critical, really. But the main thing is, it's before us for us to consider now, and you've raised that on 2 occasions, and it's only right and proper in my mind that someone's called in to account for this. and to answer questions, because, I'd also like, in some respect, to get the views of social services and education on this. What would their views? There's got to be some corporate responsibility for this. Education, presumably, contract with the PTU to deliver this service for them. I should imagine they're ultimately responsible.
Do you want me to respond to that? Sorry, Councillor. From an operational point of view, you've got a directorate and a head of service and a service manager who are responsible for the delivery of this, and other bits of the organisation are clients to that. If the committee wish to receive some statements or ask, you are inviting those other heads of service in to contribute to that conversation. I don't think that would be a particular issue. That would be entirely up to you.
I would ask for the recommendation then at some stage that we get the views of education and social services on this. Are education aware that this is happening?
I can't answer for that, Chair, but we can certainly address your concern, yeah.
Okay, well, someone can address the recommendation that we get a paper. I don't want them here, but we get a paper from education and social services on their view of this audit report and what action should be taken from their professional standpoint. Sorry, Councillor Horton.
Thank you, Chair. I'm a little bit at loss for words, really. This is a company, this is a contracted company that the council has adopted and we use and say, can you run this person here, run this person there, correct? Yes. If this is the level of competence that we have selected to support the council in the undertakings that are required, then how do the other taxi companies perform? So I wouldn't just like to call in the person that's responsible or the people responsible for this contract and this audit, but if possible, whoever is responsible for the taxi companies as a whole and how they are operating. Because if you would assume that this went out to tender and the best company won the tender. If this is the best company, potentially, then what the hell are the bad ones like? So I would like us to call in whoever is responsible to give us confidence that we don't get a press release or a police report which says something bad happened to a child, terrible. If something bad happened to a member of the public late at night, and then it transpires that we, as the council, have potentially knowingly allowed this activity, this behaviour to occur?
I think the issue for me is it's very important that the director is here and the head of service to answer those very specific questions, because we're all going to be surmising, presumably, about a lot of this. Clearly, questions are going to need to be put. Have we got one sole tenderer here providing the service? If there's a select list of tenders, then presumably you will have picked that up, but the report presumably goes across the board in regards to their processes and procedures in regards to the service they're delivering. The other question I would also pose is, has this company, who have been using unlicensed drivers and actually been using escorts who have not been approved, still being used by the council? Have they been suspended, or what's happening there? And again, unfortunately, we haven't got the people here to ask those questions. And those are the very pertinent points, really, because, as you said, Councillor Horton, if this hit the press, the council will be absolutely vilified over all this. And I think we as a committee have got to reassure that we've got that assurance that whatever's being delivered out there to the young people and the vulnerable young people using this service, it's safe, it's secure, and actually there are no issues with it. And I think the only people who can answer that are the director and the head of service. Did you want to come in, Andrew?
No, I was just going to respond to the councillor's comment, and it will be one and the same person.
Montford?
Yeah, I think we've hit a real nerve here, and this is a public meeting, and so the press could well be aware, even now, of this situation. I think what disturbs me as well is we're bringing someone in to ask them if they're aware of a situation. So this raises to me, when you find an issue of severity, what is the actual process of saying, we found something that is bad, we'll take it to the audit committee, but sometimes things need to be raised initially to the directors, to the CEO. You know, there should be another channel, and perhaps there is, and I hope there is, where this information is channeled in and saying, this is what we found, what are we going to do about it? Before, even before we go to the audit. So, and the other thing, just to pick up on Councillor Horton, we've also got a committee that does licensing for taxis, yeah? And now, presumably, that's something that should have been brought to their attention, that taxi companies are using unlicensed drivers. So, how is the process? Is the process robust enough here?
I'll start, Chair. I'm sure Andrew will want to join into this. So, just to clarify, the role of the Governance Audit Committee in here is to provide assurance that the Strategic Director and the Head of Service, who have got responsibility for ensuring this is delivered properly, are doing all the things they shouldn't. What Andrew's secondary audit has shown is that it wasn't significant progress between the first and second audits. Hence, we have this process. So there's a whole world over here that's operating in order to try and make this better. You know, your role is to challenge the pace, the activity, the actions that are being undertaken to ensure that actually those safeguards are in place. So just to reassure the committee, there won't be a process where nobody's doing anything about this. In the background, what Andrew's highlighted is there's not enough pace to that. There's not enough progress against our action plan, and Andrew can talk to you about the process. But that would be the background. So when you get them in, those questions are around, well, how are you actually trying to make this better at the moment?
So when you say there's a process, is this something that's documented that you could point me towards?
Well, the documentation for this would be in the operations service plan for that service area and about how they're operating, and that goes through performance review on a regular basis. What Andrew's highlighting, this is the documented process to find out when things have gone wrong with systems, is that internal audit process, which is independent from the rest of the organisation. So, and this is an example of that operating in the way it should. It's come to a public meeting to say that actually what we're doing at the moment isn't good enough.
Norma.
If I've missed this or haven't heard properly, but I think the point Councillor Mockford is making is the process. So an audit report presumably goes to head of service, does it?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, so it goes to head of service. Is it copied to the strategic director?
It is. The final audit is, yeah.
The final report is. So the strategic director would be aware?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
So in terms of our process, we discuss a draft report with the service manager to make sure it's factually correct. All our reports are evidential based. So in terms of, we get challenged by service managers quite a lot, but we can point to evidence to say that this is a strength or a weakness. So that's discussed at draft report level. We issue a draft report to the service manager. When we finalise that, it goes to a head of service and to a strategic director.
Sorry, I think again we've... Councillor Cox.
Yeah, the main point I think I wanted to make is that, we can all think of adjectives to describe, how people see this situation or feel about it, or we can argue about whether it should be a red or not a red critical incident. But I think, the important part for me isn't how we describe it or necessarily how we label it, but what is good about this is that we've got a system that's worked, hasn't it? And, I don't think perhaps that's been commented on enough, that there is something that is of concern, and I'll put my cards on the table. I think there are really significant issues of concern, but the system has worked. We may argue about how you label it, but the audit team have picked this up. They brought it promptly to our attention. So the bit that's important to me isn't how we describe it, but it's how we ensure that things are put as they should be. And we haven't talked a lot about that. I mean, I don't know what the current situation is with this, but whether that we're now confident this has stopped happening, I don't know if anybody can tell us that, but that's where I'd certainly like to go now. Is some means of actually either establishing whether it is going on or not, or actually bringing people here who can tell us.
Well, obviously that's what we're going to do. We're going to bring people here to tell us. And I think, hopefully I did mention earlier, I think, I agree with you, whether it's critical or significant, Andrew's team have done the right job. It's here before us to consider. So that's worked out. So I think rather than, carry on, we could discuss this again. It's a very contentious issue which affects this authority. Just picking up one point, Reece, I think whilst you said we're there to look at the assurance, and we'll get the assurances or not from the director and the head of service. Similar to what we did with social services, we'd asked for a sort of an interim report after a couple of months. But I assume if at that stage very little has changed, if it has very little has changed, then I assume that we as a committee could make a recommendation that the matter is referred to the scrutiny committee to have a fuller investigation into this, because we can't leave it lingering, because if it's been brought to our attention and we're not assured that it's got the right assurance, then we must have a way of dealing with that to send it somewhere else in the authority. And whether that's through scrutiny or somewhere else, then obviously I'll be guided by you. But I would have thought we could make a recommendation to say, look, we've got serious concerns about this. If there are serious concerns, we want scrutiny to look at it as a matter of urgency. But I do agree, I think, picking up your point, Councillor Cox, what we can't do is let this rumble on for another 3 months, even though we're going to get the director in, if these people are still being used. Because I think, for me, there needs to be a quick dive into this by social services and education to make sure they're either satisfied with these providers or not. And if it's putting the council at real risk, that's not a decision for me, but I want it noted. If it's putting the council at real risk tomorrow that this company's being used, then, I want it noted that someone makes a decision either to use them or not, because I think if we just let this float for another 3 months, we're not doing justice to this job.
And as well, Chair, it wasn't just the issue of using a particular company. I mean, what concerned me as well was the whole issue over DBSs, and people were actually getting a DBS without showing the requisite.
I understand that, Councillor Cox. I agree with that. There's a process issue here. But if we've got a specific company who's providing services to this council, who's using unlicensed drivers, who are using people who are not DBS checked, and they are the sole contractor, I don't know where they are, someone in this authority needs to make that decision to say, do we use them or actually do we suspend them until we do whatever we need to do?
Yeah, I'll try and remember my exact words I was going to say now, but I think as part of your obviously your recommendations, you've suggested a recommendation to committee, and you do agree on that. As part of that could be also to write to the Chief Education Officer, Head of Children's Services, Head of Adult Services, probably copy in the Director of Social Services within that as well, to ask for a review on that, to be as a written statement back to the committee as well around the state of play.
Clearly it's the last day in school tomorrow, so we've only got 1 day and we're not going to get those letters out tonight, and someone would have to draft them for me or whatever. But I am concerned that if they are being used, what risk that's putting the council to. But again, next week, I would hope that someone could do that quick piece of work. But the whole process, as you said, Councillor Cox, needs looking in from top to bottom.
Yeah, I think between myself and Andrew's team, we'll draft you something.
Okay. Lovely.
Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you for that, members. Obviously, we got the recommendations. Then we note the contents of the report, and that we call in the strategic director and head of service in relation to the second consecutive unsatisfactory audit payment for the PTU taxi contracts. And if we pick up the other bits in regards to a recommendation that we write to the relevant officers to get a decision in regards to, if they are being used, I would, someone needs to make a decision. Okay, someone prepared to move, please? Thank you, Councillor Horton. Someone prepared second? Councillor Mogford, thank you. Anyone against? No, thank you. Next item on the agenda is the work programme.
It's not me, Chair, but I'll take it if you would like me to. Yeah, okay, thanks. So this is the committee's work programme for the next couple of meetings, taken through to January, March and then on to May. We've listed the reports that will be forthcoming. It is draft, and that could be subject to change as things progress, as updates become more available and fed into Governance and Audit Committee. So if anybody's got any comments on the content of those agenda items, please let us know.
Again, I think given it's a flexible programme really, because obviously things may happen between now and January. So as long as that flexibility is there, the two items obviously that need to be added is the call-in of the PTU contract and an interim update, if we can, on the social services issue. But, I don't want war and peace on it, really, just a short A4 sheet if we can. And
yeah, that's fine, Chair. We'll include those for the January's meeting, yeah.
Thank you very much. Someone prepared to move then that the work programme be adopted? Thank you, Don. Someone second? Thank you, Councillor Cox. Anyone against? No. We've got the action table then, which is item 9. I think we did that earlier on. So I think we just note that in regards to moving forward. Date of the next meeting then is the 26th of January 2023 at 5 p.m. Can I thank everyone certainly for attending this evening? I think there's been some excellent discussion and debate on these issues. Thank the members for their contribution. Can I thank the officers for their input? Can I thank Democratic Services for actually putting the names on top, so I actually know who's here now. So thank you very much, Democratic Services team. That's very good of you. And I don't know whether this is the first time you say it. Can I wish everyone a very Merry Christmas? Because obviously I'm not going to be coming back until January 26, and a prosperous new year, I hope. I don't envy people in local government. Once the settlement will be known in December, I think there's going to be a lot of hard work, and I expect burning the midnight oil. But can I just say thank you, everyone. Thank you for the